It's easy to understand why the Gospel of Mark would have been written as a means of narrativizing the sayings of Jesus, but what would motivate someone to compose a second Gospel, not only one that incorporates these sayings, but includes most of Mark as well? If Mark's Gospel uses the messianic secret to keep the identity and mission of Jesus somewhat concealed, then Matthew's Gospel blows the doors wide open to reveal Jesus as the Messiah. Compared to Mark, Matthew is a far more Jewish take on the figure of Jesus, indicated even by the very first verse of the Gospel. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. In the Greek, it is literally, this is the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ, drawing a connection to the first book of the Torah. While Mark's Gospel unveils an unexpected Messiah who takes on the role of suffering servant and later the Son of Man, it's as if Matthew's author wants to emphasize that this is still, without a doubt, the Messiah promised to the Jews. According to Isaiah 11:1-2, the Messiah will be a descendant of David, and the spirit and knowledge of God will rest upon him. He will rebuild the Jewish temple and reunite the Israelites in their homeland. During the reign of the Messiah, there will be universal peace. All nations of the world will worship the God of Israel. Knowledge of God will fill the whole earth, and the dead will rise from their graves. Unlike Mark, Matthew's Gospel includes a genealogy and birth narrative to establish the importance of Jesus. Not only is he a descendant of David, but his birth is foretold by an angel connected with Isaiah 7:14, marked by the Star of Bethlehem, identified with Micah 5:2, seen as a threat to Herod resulting in the massacre of the infants, allegedly prophesied in Jeremiah 31:15, and so forth. The purpose of this added material is not to tell us what Jesus was like as a child, but specifically to stress his messianic status. This is part of why I hesitate to identify the Gospels as the Greek genre of bios, or biography. They are, to a large degree, not about Jesus as a person, or about the character of Jesus, but about presenting him as the Messiah, or as divine manifestation. There is not the concern for relating Jesus with the esteemed Hellenistic virtues that we find front and center in Greco-Roman biographies of the time, like Lucian on Demonax, Nepos on Atticus, Philo on Moses, or even Philostratus on Apollonius. Of course, that's not to say that Jesus doesn't teach virtues in the Gospels. Another way that Matthew's Gospel differs from Mark's is in the use of sermons and expanded teachings over the short, pithy sayings of Jesus. In Matthew, Jesus is most certainly a teacher, and some of what he teaches would have appealed to Hellenistic sensibilities. But, as in all the canonical Gospels, the primary point of Jesus' ministry is to further indicate his role as Messiah, apocalyptic Son of Man, etc. I believe this is why the Gospels are better described as kerygma, or proclamation or preaching, rather than biography. Matthew's focus on Jesus' teaching revolves around the Torah, or 5 books of Moses. During his temptation by the devil, Jesus responds with 3 citations from the book of Deuteronomy. In Matthew 5:17-20, Jesus makes it abundantly clear that he has no intention of overturning the teachings of the law or the prophets, but actually advocates that people follow it with righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. The remaining verses in the chapter show that this is no metaphorical statement, as Jesus teaches that anger is subject to judgment just as murder is, that looking lustfully at a woman is adultery, that divorce is adultery except in cases of sexual immorality, that oaths should never be taken, he teaches to turn the other cheek, and finally says to love your enemies. These teachings are great examples both of how anti-Hellenistic some of the Gospels are, and also how intensely pro-Torah Jesus is in Matthew. This emphasis probably derives from the prophecy in Isaiah 11:2 about the Messiah having the spirit and knowledge of God. Even when Jesus clashes with the Pharisees in Matthew, he does so not because they are his enemies, but because in his view they are not really properly observing the commands of the Torah, and as religious authorities they ought to know better. In chapter 23 he puts it plainly, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach." On the mention of Moses, it's interesting to note how Jesus' birth narrative in Matthew shares a good deal in common with Moses. There is obviously the slaughter of the children, which was also perpetrated by Pharaoh in the Exodus story. There's the flight into Egypt and return home, which is associated with Hosea 11:1 in Matthew's Gospel, originally a passage referring to Moses in the Exodus. Even the Star of Bethlehem is connected to Moses in the Pentateuch, since it alludes to a prophecy in Numbers 24:17. All these references to Moses are most likely in suggestion of Deuteronomy 18:17-19, where a prophet like Moses is predicted, one who will speak on God's behalf, and to whom everyone will be held accountable. Though this actually means Joshua, later Jews and Christians began applying it to the Messiah. One thing of particular interest to me is the difference between Mark and Matthew regarding the burial of Jesus. In Mark, Joseph of Arimathea simply rolls a stone in front of his tomb where he has buried Jesus. Matthew, however, describes the stone as a great or large stone and introduces a seal on it, as well as guards posted at the tomb. This latter detail of the guards is only found in Matthew and is explained by a plea from the chief priests and Pharisees to Pilate, who are concerned that the disciples may steal the body. And after Jesus is raised, this is exactly what they say, that the disciples stole the body. Christian apologists love to knock down the stolen body theory by mentioning the guards at the tomb, the size of the stone, and the seal on the stone. But note that these are all details added by Matthew which are not found in Mark, the earliest gospel. There is something to be said for perhaps a historical nugget to the stolen body charge, too. If the early Christians had been going around preaching an empty tomb, an objector could certainly have brought up the possibility that the disciples simply snuck the body out overnight. To counter this objection, the author of Matthew may have added these extra security measures to the story. When was Matthew's Gospel written? Most scholars estimate sometime between 80 to 90 CE, certainly after the composition of Mark, but also before the beginning of the 2nd century, when Ignatius and other early Christian authors began to quote from and reference the text. J.C. Fenton also sees evidence of a post-85 dating based on some of the Gospel's anti-Jewish content, which he suggests to be the result of Christians being excluded from Jewish synagogues around that time. What about the authorship of Matthew? Was it written by the disciple and tax collector? While there is a fair amount of material that is unique to the Gospel, it also uses almost all of Mark as well as the Q source, and generally follows the outline of Mark too. Some scholars have proposed that a good deal of the unique material to Matthew, often called M, comes from additional sources now lost to us, but not composed by Matthew's author. No explanation has been able to reasonably account for why a supposed eyewitness should rely on testimony other than his own. More problematic, however, is the statement of Papias about a gospel attributed to Matthew. Papias, quoted by Eusebius, reports that Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. The trouble with this remark is that the only copies of Matthew we have found are in Greek that doesn't read like a translation and is formed from other Greek sources like Mark and presumably Q. Although Matthew, like most of the New Testament, contains some Semitic idioms, these may be explained by the use of the Septuagint, which was a translation of Hebrew into Greek, or they may even be explained as reproductions of colloquial Greek that are not actually Semitic in origin. Those who wish to rest a case for an originally Hebrew text of Matthew on the presence of Semitic idioms do so in defiance of the manuscript evidence, the general absence of translational peculiarities, and the two-source hypothesis. It's interesting to note that not only does Richard Bauckham say the least about Matthew and Jesus and the eyewitnesses, but he also agrees that the disciple Matthew was probably not the author of the text. Sadly, this doesn't prevent him from speculating about Matthew being somewhere in the background as an eyewitness source used in the Gospel. One of the central arguments in Baukham's book is that names of figures who are participants in the stories, to a large extent, identify eyewitness sources. As he notes, the Gospels share a good number of named characters, but some drop certain names and some actually add names. Richard theorizes that a name is added where an author is aware of the eyewitness, or when it's no longer dangerous to name the eyewitness, and a name is omitted where the eyewitness has become obscure in the community. To my recollection, though, Bauckham presents no contemporary examples of this practice outside of the Christian world. Stephen Patterson, in a critical review of Baukham's book published in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, points out that some of this pattern of naming is really not as bizarre as it seems. What is the case, he asks, with Luke 4:22, where Luke omits Mark's reference to Jesus' mother and brothers? In fact, he continues, 4 of these 6 cases of omission where Matthew and or Luke omit names from Mark are minor agreements and should probably be accounted for in terms of this literary phenomenon. A good guess would be that these names were added in the subsequent development of Mark after Matthew and Luke had made use of earlier versions of Mark as a source. Bauckham also notes that the Gospel authors would likely have had to cut some of the content from their sources. Writing materials were not cheap, and manuscript prices were partly based on length, meaning that if Matthew's author was adding in Q, Mark, perhaps some other unknown sources, and maybe even his own content, he would have had to make adjustments. We know that he was engaged in redactional work, and it's quite plausible names were omitted as part of the process. In fact, the two instances in Matthew where names are dropped from Mark and stories are instances where the characters are arguably unimportant. But isn't it a bit strange that, in light of his thesis, Bauckham should be addressing names omitted from the Gospels in the first place? If, as he believes, names preserved eyewitness sources and were used for the purpose of demonstrating reliability, and all four Gospel authors were engaged in this practice, then why do certain Gospels drop some of these names? Saying that these eyewitnesses were no longer known is hardly a sufficient explanation if we are to think that the authors and their audience were expecting this proof of sorts. We will look at more of Bauckham's arguments in the next video, where the Gospels of Luke and John will be under discussion.